The monarch of Scotland was the head of state of the Kingdom of Scotland. According to tradition, the first King of Scots was Kenneth I MacAlpin Cianád Mac Bailpin, who founded the state in 843. Historically, the Kingdom of Scotland is thought to have grown out of an earlier Kingdom of the Picts, though in reality the distinction is a product of later medieval myth and confusion from a change in nomenclature, i.e. Rex Pictorum King of the Picts becomes Ri Alban King of Helb. Under Donald I, when Cannel switched from Latin to vernacular around the end of the 9th century, by which time the word Albi in Scottish Gaelic had come to refer to the Kingdom of the Picts rather than Britain, its older meaning Dawn. The Kingdom of the Picts just became known as Kingdom of Albi in Scottish Gaelic, which later became known in Scots and English as Scotland. The terms are retained in both languages to this day. By the late 11th century at the very latest, Scottish kings were using the term Rex Scotorum, or King of Scots, to refer to themselves in Latin. The Kingdom of Scotland was merged with the Kingdom of England to form a single Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707. Thus Queen Anne became the last monarch of the ancient kingdoms of Scotland and England and the first of Great Britain, although the kingdoms had shared a monarch since 1603. See Union of the Crowns. Her uncle Charles II was the last monarch to be crowned in Scotland, at Scone in 1651. He had a second coronation in England 10 years later. The reign of Kenneth MacAlpin begins what is often called the House of Alpin, an entirely modern concept. The descendants of Kenneth MacAlpin were divided into two branches. The crown would alternate between the two, the death of a king from one branch often hastened by war or assassination by a pretender from the other. Malcolm II was the last king of the House of Alpin. In his reign, he successfully crushed all opposition to him and, having no sons, was able to pass the crown to his daughter's son, Duncan I, who inaugurated the House of Dunkeld. House of Dunkeld 1034–1286. See also, House of Dunkeld. Duncan succeeded to the throne as the maternal grandson of Malcolm II. He was also the heir general of Malcolm I, as his paternal grandfather, Duncan of Atholl, was the third son of Malcolm I. The House of Dunkeld was therefore closely related to the House of Alpin. Duncan was killed in battle by Macbeth, who had a long and relatively successful reign. In a series of battles between 1057 and 1058, Duncan's son Malcolm III defeated and killed Macbeth and Macbeth's stepson and heir Lulac, claiming the throne. The dynastic feuds did not end there. On Malcolm III's death in battle, his brother Donald III, known as Ban, claimed the throne, expelling Malcolm III's sons from Scotland. A civil war in the family ensued, with Donald III and Malcolm III's son Edmund opposed by Malcolm III's English-backed sons, led first by Duncan II and then by Edgar. Edgar triumphed, sending his uncle and brother to monasteries. After the reign of David I, the Scottish throne was passed according to rules of primogeniture, moving from father to son, or where not possible, brother to brother. Father Alpin Mac Ecdac Kenneth MacAlpin, Medieval Gaelic, Cianád Mac Bailpin, Modern Scottish Gaelic, Coinich Mac Bailpin A. 810, February 13, 858. Or Kenneth I was King of Decali Derrida 841–850, King of the Picts 843–858, and the King of Helba 843–858. He inherited the throne of Decali Derrida from his father Alpin Mac Ecdac, founder of the Alpinid dynasty. Kenneth I conquered the Kingdom of the Picts in 843–850 and began a campaign to seize all of Scotland and assimilate the Picts, for which he was posthumously nicknamed Inferbaisac the Conqueror. One Fort Via became the capital of his kingdom, and he also fought the Britons of the Kingdom of Strathclyde and the invading Vikings from Scandinavia. Kenneth also relocated relics including the Stone of Scone from an abandoned abbey on Iona to his new domain. Kenneth I is traditionally considered the founder of Scotland, which was then known as Helb, although like his immediate successors, he bore the title of King of the Picts. One chronicle calls Kenneth the first Scottish lawgiver, but there is no information about the laws he passed. According to the genealogy of the Scottish kings, Kenneth's father was Alpin Mac Ecdac, the King of Decali Derrida, which existed in what is now western Scotland. Alpin is considered to be the grandson of Eadfine, the descendant of Semel and Giabrain, who ruled in Decali Derrida. The synchronism of the Irish kings lists Alpin among the kings of Scotland. Modern historians are skeptical about the reign of Halpin in Dekli-Dariada and his relationship with Ede, and believe this misconception is the result of negligence on the part of the scribes in some texts. The genealogy of the kings of Scotland and Dekli-Dariada dates back to an original manuscript that was written during the reign of Malcolm III in the mid to late 11th century. The Rawlinson B502 manuscript provides the following ancestry for Kenneth. Chenid son of Halpin son of Eochaid son of Eadfine son of Domangert son of Domnallbrecht son of Eochaidbide son of Eda son of Gatebrand son of Domangert son of Fergus More. There is very limited information about Halpin, the father of Kenneth. Some of Dekli-Dariada's royal lists, which contain many scribal errors, say he ruled from 841 to 843. The Chronicle of Huntingdon, which was written in the late 13th century, states Halpin defeated the Picts at Galloway, but the Picts then defeated him in a battle that took place in the same year, during which Halpin was killed. According to the Chronicle, Halpin died on July 20, 834. This date is given in other sources, but several researchers claim the date was probably copied from another source and the year of his death was obtained by recalculating the dates in the erroneous royal lists, so they attribute Halpin's date of death to 840 or 841. Halpin's mother is likely to have been a Pictish princess, the sister of Constantine I and Oengus II. According to the Pictish tradition, a female representative of the royal dynasty could inherit the crown. This origin gave Kenneth the legitimate claim to the Pictish throne. Kenneth I had at least one brother, Donald I, who succeeded him as king. Life and reign. Early years. Kenneth MacAlpin is believed to have been born around 810 on the island of Iona, which is part of modern-day Scotland. After his father's death, Kenneth succeeded him as the king of Dekli-Dariada. His coronation took place in 840 or 841. One of the main sources on the life of Kenneth is the 10th century Chronicle of the Kings of Alba, and describes the reigns of Scottish kings from Kenneth I to Kenneth II. Conquest of Pictavia. According to the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba, Kenneth came to a region that was inhabited by the Picts during the second year of his reign in Dekli-Dariada. Having defeated the Picts, Kenneth ruled there for 16 years. According to the Annals of Ulster, compiled in the 15th century, he became the king of the Picts in 842 or 843, and died in 858. Although some sources state Kenneth ruled the Picts from 841 to 856, according to the Chronicle of Melrose, he became king in 843, the date that is generally accepted by most modern-day historians. Illustration of Kenneth MacAlpin by Jacob de Wet II, 1684–1686. In the first half of the 9th century, the geopolitical situation in Dekli-Dariada deteriorated. Almost the entire territory of the kingdom was mountainous, and was filled with uneasy terrain. Kenneth's realm lay between the powerful kingdom of Strathclyde in the south and the Drewin-Aldern mountain ridge in the east. It was difficult to pass through the provinces of Dekli-Dariada. Most of the land was infertile, and the kingdom had lost its western territories in the Hebrides to the Vikings, who had settled in the area and were raiding the borders of Dekli-Dariada. These conditions may have forced Kenneth to attack the Picts. After the death of Eochaid mac Oenguza in 839, Uhtred, and then Bright VI succeeded him as the king of the Picts. According to List 1, Uhtred's reign lasted 3 years, while Brut VI reigned for a year. According to List 2, Uhtred reigned for 2 years, while Bright VI's reign lasted a month. The reigns of Uhtred's 3 sons were also present in List 2. Based on these accounts, the Pictish kingdom fell in 849 or 850. Many sources dating to the following periods state that the historical kingdom of the Picts and the Scots unified in 850. List 2 states that the last Pictish king was killed in Fort or Scone. This is probably a reference to MacAlpin's treason, a medieval legend first recorded in the 12th century by Giraldus Cambrensis. According to the legend, a Pictish nobleman is invited by the Scots to a meeting or a feast in Scone and is treacherously killed there. At the same time, List 1 gives the year 843 as the date when Kenneth received the title of King of the Picts. Sources do not detail Kenneth's conquest of Pictavia. No chronicle mentions either Kenneth's continuing his father's campaign against the Picts or his supposed claim to the Pictish crown. Modern-day historians suggest Kenneth was a descendant of Pictish kings Thuro his mother or had ties with them Thuro his wife. It is likely the death of Eobinan, and the heavy losses sustained on the Picts in a battle against the Viking invaders, had weakened the Picts' military might. It is also possible Kenneth's visit to Pictavia began as a rebellion against the Pictish dominion as the Pictish forces of Oengus had occupied Decali Derrida and made it its vassal in 741. The Chronicle of Huntingdon gives the following interpretation of the events that took place after Eoganan's death. Cynatius Kenneth succeeded his father Alpin in his kingdom, and that in the 7th year of his reign the year 839 while the Danish pirates, having occupied the Pictish shores, had crushed the Picts, who were defending themselves, with a great slaughter, Cynatius, passing into their remaining territories, turned his arms against them, and having slain many, compelled them to take flight, and was the first king of the Skalds who acquired the monarchy of the whole of Helbin, and ruled in it. Over the Skalds, it is likely Kenneth killed the Pictish leaders and destroyed their armies during his conquest of Pictavia, after which he devastated the whole country. The annals of the Four Masters record a single battle during Kenneth's campaign, which according to Isabel Henderson, proves the Picts did not show any significant resistance to Kenneth's forces. King of Helba according to historical tradition, a new kingdom was formed after Kenneth annexed the kingdom of the Picts. This kingdom's Gaelic name was Helba, which was later replaced with Scotia and Scotland. The rulers of the kingdom initially held the title of King of Helba. Kenneth is listed in the royal lists dating to later periods as the first king of Scotland. Modern historians, however, believe the final unification of the kingdom took place half a century later and that Kenneth's main political achievement should be considered the creation of a new dynasty. This dynasty sought to dominate all of Scotland, under which the Scots assimilated the Picts, resulting in their quick disappearance of the Picts' language and institutions. Illustration of the Stone of Scone in the coronation chair at Westminster Abbey, 1855. After the conquest of Pictavia, the Scots from Decali Derrida began to migrate en masse to the territories populated by the Picts. The list of Pictish kings concludes in 850 and the list of kings of Decali Derrida also ends around the same time, meaning the title ceased to exist. Kenneth I and his administration moved to Pictavia. It is possible the Scots moved to the region before the war and that such settlements played a major role in the selection of Scone as the kingdom's capital. Kenneth moved relics from an abandoned abbey on Iona, where Viking raids made life untenable, to Dunkeld, which was the centre of the Church of Scotland, in 848 or 849, according to the Chronicle of the Kings of Helba. The coronation stone was also moved from the island to Scone, for which it is referred to as the Stone of Scone. According to archaeological excavations, Fortavia was probably originally the royal residence but the place is not mentioned in the chronicles after the death of Donald I. The mass migration of Scots to the east most likely led to the assimilation of the Picts. Although the Irish Annals, which dates to the late 9th century, mentions the title King of the Picts, the Picts may not have remained independent. The Pictish civil system and clerical laws were completely replaced with the Scottish legal system, and it is likely similar changes occurred in other spheres of the Pictish society. The Picts did not revolt against this assimilation process. The Chronicle of the Kings of Helba describes the events that occurred during Kenneth's reign without specifying their dates. He invaded Lothian in the Kingdom of Northumbria 6 times, and captured the towns of Melrose and Dunbar, and razed them. The Celtic Britons from the Kingdom of Strathclyde attacked Kenneth's kingdom and burnt Dunblane. Furthermore, Viking invaders raided Pictavia, ravaging the territories from Cluna to Dunkeld. Kenneth strengthened his power by arranging royal marriages with neighbouring states, marrying his daughters to the kings of Strathclyde and Ireland. According to the Chronicle of Melrose, Kenneth was one of the first Scottish lawgivers but his laws have not survived to the 21st century. Death and succession. According to the Annals of Ulster, Kenneth died in 858. The Chronicle of the Kings of Helba states he died in February in Fortavia due to a tumor. Historians suggest this date might be February 13. Kenneth was buried in Iona Abbey. Succession in the kingdom was carried out in the form of tanistry, so Kenneth's successor was his brother Donald rather than his eldest son. After the death of Donald I, the sons of Kenneth, Cosatan mac Cineada and Ed mac Cineada, inherited the crown. The Alkenid dynasty, which ruled Scotland until the beginning of the 11th century, was formed during this period. 3723-24 Contemporaneous Irish annals give Kenneth and his immediate successors the title King of the Picts but do not call him the King of Fortriu, the title that was only given to 4 Pictish kings who reigned in the 7th to 9th centuries. It is possible the use of the title of King of the Picts was in reference to Kenneth and his immediate successors claimed to all of Pictavia, though there is very little evidence of the extent of their domain. Threed family. The name of Kenneth's wife is unknown. There is a hypothesis she may have been a Pictish princess. Kenneth's children were 7. The better example of direct African ancestry in British royalty is Queen Charlotte Sophia, George II's wife and Victoria's grandmother. I have often wondered if she was in any way instrumental to British abolition of the slave trade. With features reputed to be conspicuously African by her contemporaries, it is no wonder that the black community, both in the U.S. and throughout the British Commonwealth, has rallied for generations around depictions of Queen Charlotte, portrayed as she usually is in the regal and sumptuous splendor of her coronation. Robes. Queen Charlotte 1744–1818, wife of the English King George III 1738–1820, was directly descended from Margarida de Castro y Souza, a black branch of the Portuguese royal house. The riddle of Queen Charlotte's African ancestry was solved inadvertently as the result of an earlier investigation into imagery of the Black Magi featured in certain 15th-century Flemish paintings of the Christmas narrative. A couple of art historians had suggested that they must have been portraits of actual contemporaries since the artist, without seeing them, would not have been aware of the subtleties in coloring and facial bone structure of individuals of African descent, which these figures invariably represented. Enough evidence has been accumulated to propose that the model were, in all probability, members of the Portuguese de Sousa family. Several relatives had accompanied their cousin Princess Isabella to the Netherlands when she arrived there in 1429 to marry the Grand Duke, Philip the Good of Burgundy. At least 492 lines of descent can be traced from Queen Charlotte through her triple ancestry from Margarida de Castro y Souza to Martin Alfonso de Sousa Chicharo, the illegitimate son of King Alfonso of Portugal and his Moorish mistress, Oruna/Madragana. Interestingly enough, in a gene pool that was comparatively minuscule due to royal inbreeding, it was from Martin Alfonso's de Sousa wife, Inés de Valadares, that the British Queen inherited most of her African Islamic ancestry. Queen Charlotte's portrait. The royal family's African characteristics evident in so many of the Queen's portraits certainly had political significance, since artists of that period were expected to play down, soften or even obliterate features in a subject's face, especially a woman's, that were not considered to meet the standards of beauty for the times. Sir Allan Ramsay was the artist responsible for the majority of the paintings of the Queen, and his representations of her were the most decidedly African of all her portraits. Ramsay's anti-slavery sentiments were well known. He'd also married the niece of Lord Mansfield, the English judge whose 1772 decision was the first in a series of rulings that finally ended slavery in the British Empire. It should be noted too that by the time Sir Ramsay was commissioned to do his first portrait of the Queen, he was already, by marriage, uncle to Dido Elizabeth Lindsay, the black grandniece of Lord Mansfield. Thus, from just a cursory look at the social awareness and political activism at that level of English society, it would be surprising if the Queen's African features were of no significance to the abolitionist movement. The royal family. Lord Mansfield's black grandniece, for example, Miss Lindsay, was the subject of at least 2 formal full-size portraits. Obviously prompted by or meant to appeal to abolitionist sympathies, they depicted the celebrated friendship between herself and the white cousin. It is perhaps because of this fairly obvious case of pointed portraiture that makes one suspect that Queen Charlotte's coronation picture, copies of which were sent out to all 4 corners of the empire, signified a specific stance on slavery held at least by that circle of the English intelligentsia, to which Ramsay belonged. More on Queen Charlotte revealed, the Queen's black ancestors. The Times of London reports that a Portuguese descendant of Queen Charlotte confirmed Voldag's research into her heritage. June 6, 1999 was this Britain's first black queen. The suggestion that Queen Charlotte was black implies that her granddaughter Queen Victoria and her great-great-great-great-granddaughter Queen Elizabeth II had African forebears. Perhaps, instead of just being a boring bunch of semi-inbred white stiffs, our royal family becomes much more interesting. The Guardian. March 12, 2009. On this side of the Atlantic, the slogan, "The Queen of England was a Negro woman," was weaponized by the Vice Admiral, Sir Alexander Cochrane, in his campaign to persuade enslaved people to defect to the British during the 1812 war. More than 4,000 ultimately did, making it the largest emancipation in the U.S. until the Civil War. For the initial work into Queen Charlotte's genealogy, the debt of gratitude is owed the History Department of McGill University. It was the director of the Burney Project, Fanny Burney, the prolific 19th-century British diarist, had been secretary to the Queen Dr. Joyce Hemlow, who obtained from Olin Headley, the most recent biographer of the Queen Charlotte 1975, at least half a dozen quotes by her contemporaries regarding her features. Because of its scientific source, the most valuable of Dr. Headley's references would probably be the one published in the autobiography of the royal family's physician, Baron Stockmar, where he described her as having a true mulatto face. Perhaps the most literary of these allusions to her African appearance, however, can be found in the poem penned to her on the occasion of her wedding to George III and the coronation celebration that followed a fortnight later. Descended from the warlike Bengal race, she still preserves that title in her face. Though shown their triumphs o'er Numidia's plain, and Aleutian fields their name retain, they but subdued the southern world with arms, she conquers still with her triumphant charms. Oh, born for rule, to whose victorious brow the greatest monarch of the North must bow. The reference to King George as King of the North is an allusion to Charlotte as Queen of the South, which in biblical terms is the Black Queen of Sheba and, by inference, her husband King Solomon. Finally, it should be noted that in 1956, 3 years after Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, the crown referred to both her Asian and African bloodlines, the latter through Zeta, the wife of Alfonso I of Castile, in an apologia defending her position as head of the British Commonwealth and mother of a quarter of the population of the world. Entitled Blood Royal, it is by Sir Rupert Ian Caedmon Criaghirn, and Dot Ottinger. More about research into the Black Magi. In 15th-century Flemish masterpieces depicting the adoration of the Magi, the imagery of the Black Deusses was utilized as both religious and political propaganda to support Portugal's expansion into Africa. In addition, the Flemish artists had drawn from a vocabulary of blackness, which, due no doubt to the Reformation, the Enlightenment and, of course, the transatlantic slave trade, has long since been forgotten. Indeed, a veritable wealth of positive symbolism that had been attributed to the black African figure during the mystical heights of the Middle Ages. Such images had been used to represent not only the biblical Mary, evidence of which can be found in the cult of the Black Madonna that once proliferated in Europe, but in heraldic traditions, Jesus Christ himself. Male Muir and Jensine Eddock. She married Ed Findlayth R862879, the High King of Ireland. There is also the theory the wife of Amlade Canong R853871, the King of Dublin, was a daughter of Kenneth. 9 Sigillumsccretum secret seal on the image of the blackamoor in European heraldry. A preliminary proposal for an iconographical study by Mario D. Valdes Wycocum, considering the deep roots of Christianity in the cultural experience of the African American community, it is only natural that even in the most cursory of discussions on black history, the hope always is raised of discovering Christ as a man of color. Moreover, in this global village of television and transatlantic travel, the standard Eurocentric portrayal of Christ is both anomalous and anachronistic, particularly in these racially sensitized times. It might therefore prove a great source of spiritual strength and psychological affirmation for those of us of African descent if the relatively unknown and forgotten medieval European tradition regarding the image of the black was reconstructed for all to see and share. What I am referring to are the coat of arms of the blackamoor, which proliferated in both the private and civic European discussion coat of arms throughout the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries. Due likely to the tradition attached to Sardinia's arms, these insignia have been all too facilely explained as the grisly price of some crusader conquest. The 4 African heads each displayed in one of the 4 quarters created by the cross on the shield are referred to by an early motto associated with this island's crest as Truthia. The traditional explanation is they represent the 4 Moorish emirs who were defeated by a king of Aragon sometime in the 11th century. The possibility of a more probable approach to these insignia will be raised further on. Such an interpretation would, of course, be more than welcome today. especially in the face of establishment attempts to portray as white the Islamic power that was able to withstand 3 successive waves of European invasions. And, a common corollary to this negative view was the African figure became a symbol of evil, universal or personal, that had to be subjugated or vanquished. Given the economic/political positions of those with the right to bear arms, the hold that heraldry has had on the imagination of the West has been a very powerful one, and this particular perception of the blackamoor as a symbol of the negative has undoubtedly played an enormous part in the propagation of racism. Articles about Mario D. Valdes-White-Occam's research and writings on Street Maurice the Pope and a puzzling African king. Boston Globe columnist Alex Bean turned to Valdes for help decoding the African king depicted on new Pope Benedict XVI's coat of arms. August 4, 2005. Catholic Martyrs' Ancient Sacrifice seen as symbol for African American community. If an award-winning Boston television producer has his way, the legend of St. Moritz will be recaptured from the dustbin of history to inspire the new generation to turn away from violence and self-indulgence and live up to the principles of fidelity, humility and service personified by the saint. The Bay State Banner, July 27, 2006. A fresh take on the life of a saint. As a boy growing up in Belize, Central America, Mr. Valdes absorbed the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. He said St. Moritz's exploits are the black foundations of the King Arthur stories. But does the message of a battle-ready black martyr stand a chance of being heard in a youth culture that embraces thugs and pimps as heroes and role models? The Ottawa Citizen, August 3, 2006. Plea to St. Moritz, give them strength. If you Google Street Moritz these days, you'll come up with scads of information about the chic Swiss ski resort. But Valdes hopes to reclaim the name as a symbol of strength and will. Also, read Valdes' follow-up letter, and view the painting mentioned in the article. The Boston Globe, March 18, 2007. Imagery of St. Maurice. Modern specialists in the science of heraldry suspect, however, that this blazoned coat of arms of the blackamoor is instead the very opposite of a negative symbol. In the last decade or two it has been pointed out that the Moor's head quite possibly could have referred to St. Maurice, the black patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire from the beginning of the 10th century. Because of his name and native land, St. Maurice had been portrayed as black ever since the 12th century. The insignia of the black head, in a great many instances, was probably meant to represent this soldier saint, since a majority of the arms awarded were knightly or military. With 6,666 of his African compatriots, St. Maurice had chosen martyrdom rather than deny his allegiance to his Lord and Savior, thereby creating for the Christian world an image of the church militant that was as impressive numerically as it was color-wise. Here, no doubt, is a major reason why St. Maurice would become the champion of the old Roman Church and an opposition symbol to the growing influence of Luther and Calvin. The fact that he was of the same race as the Ethiopian baptized by St. Philippinex of the Apostles was undoubtedly an important element to his significance as well. Since this figure from the New Testament was read as a personification of the Gentile world in its entirety, the complexion of St. Maurice and his Theban legion, the number of which signified an infinite contingent, was also understood as a representation of the Church's universality, a dogmatic ideal no longer tolerated by the Reformation's nationalism. Furthermore, it cannot be coincidental that the most powerful of the German princes to remain within the Catholic fold, the Archbishop Albrecht von Brandenburg, not only dedicated practically all the major institutions under his jurisdiction to St. Maurice, but in what is today one of the most important paintings of the Renaissance, had himself portrayed in sacred conversation with him. Even more blatant was the action taken by Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy. In 1572 he organized the Order of St. Maurice. The papal promulgation published at its institution declared quite unequivocally that the sole purpose for this knighthood was to combat of the Reformation. The order still exists, although it has now combined with the Order of St. Lazarus. The white trefoiled cross of the combined order belongs to the former. The particular symbol of St. Maurice's blackness that must have most antagonized the Protestant faction, however, was the one regarding the mystery of papal authority. Scholars have been able to show, for example, that in the theological debates of this period, even the abstract adjectives, black and white, were defiantly acknowledged by apologists of both stripes to represent the Church and the Reformers respectively. Prester John. In addition to St. Maurice, There is also another figure connected to the Blackamoor coat of arms. It is the semi-mythical Negus Emperor of Ethiopia, Prester John. To Otto von Freising, an imperial Hohenstaufen Prince-Bishop of the 12th century who was tired and torn by the endless struggle between church and state, this black man who was both priest and king and ruled a land of peace and plenty at the edge of the world became the personification of the ideal state. To this day the arms of the seed of Freising is the bust of a crowned Blackamoor. Because of their ethnic and geographic origins, it is likely that Saint Maurice and his Theban legion became associated with Prester John as the ideal soldiers for the ideal state. It should be pointed out, furthermore, that, heraldically, since he was the only monarch who could claim the Sangreal or the royal blood of Christ because of his descent from Solomon, Prester John was the only individual deemed worthy of the right to bear as arms the image of the crucifix. Even the earring traditionally worn by the Blackamoor is a reference to this sacred privilege. The golden ring in the Blackamoor's ear. To understand how these two objects are related to each other, the earring and the image of the crucifix, we must refer back to the Old Testament. In the book of Leviticus can be found an ordinance describing the ritual ear piercing of any slave who chooses to continue in his master's service after being granted his freedom. Since one of the most important of all Ethiopian royal titles was Slave of the Cross, the golden ring in the Blackamoor's ear was probably meant to be interpreted as a deeply devotional, and considering the belief in the Bible as the Word of God, a highly rhetorical symbol. Ethiopia and the Holy Grail due also to the age-old belief that the Ark of the Covenant had been hidden in Ethiopia. The great epics of the Arthurian cycle transformed the Ethiopian emperor into the founder of the Grail dynasty and the ancestor, 9 generations later, of the only knight of the Round Table who would achieve the quest, Sir Galahad. It would appear that the long-standing confusion over whether the Holy Grail was a cup or a stone was a deliberate one. Considering the opportunity afforded by these Ethiopian traditions, medieval writers were able to theologically fuse together the symbols of both the Old and the New Testament, the tablet of the law and the chalice. Sigillumscretum part II divine darkness. In the middle of the 14th century, one of the most profound examples of the symbol of the Blackamoor can be seen in the use of this image to represent Christ. It is clear from the documentation we have for the city of Lauingen in Germany, for example, that at about this time, the city's seal with the head of Christ wearing a crown of thorns is transformed to the head of a Blackamoor wearing a golden crown. That the latter insignia is meant to represent the former is quite obvious from the accompanying inscriptions. One of the earlier ones read, Sigillum Citium de Lucingen, seal of the city of Lauingen, while a later version clearly explains itself as the Sigillum Secretum Civitatis Palatini Laugingen, secret seal of the Palatinate and 8th city of Lauingen. The German heraldic scholar writing before World War II offered 2 other reasons for a similar coats of arms. He pointed out that Ethiop's sun burnt the black was a sun sign and therefore a symbol of divinity that could alternately be used for the Son of God or the Son of Man. He also pointed out that from what we know of the cult of the Black Madonna, the blazon of the Blackamoor Queen was a reference to Mary, the Queen of Heaven, or her prefiguration as the Queen of Sheba, and that the male versions of these insignia were therefore references to her son. The discovery of this particular seal was especially surprising to me, since I had taken for granted that it was either another reference to Prester John or, even more likely, to Balthazar, the Black Wise Man of the Epiphany, who has, iconographically, almost always been treated as a king, because his gift of myrrh prophesied not only our Lord's death but, most importantly, his resurrection, and the proof, therefore, of his divinity. The of Balthazar's Lapis inspired must have had a powerful impression on the science of heraldry. The coat of arms that is apparently derived from the same theological source as that of the city of Lauingen belongs to the Cruz or Cross family of France. Since cockle shells are so liturgically associated with the sacrament of baptism, their number here probably signifies the 3 nails of the crucifixion, while the women, in all likelihood, are representations of Mary and the Queen of Sheba. The arms of King Balthazar, no more graphic the demonstration of the African figure as a symbol of the sun is to be found than in the arms ascribed to King Balthazar. Initially this had posed a problem for me, since the ethnic background of this wise man, to my mind, was simply not enough of a reason for this heraldic device. It was not until coming upon an early text describing his coat of arms as that of the sun that I at last realized what the Blackamoor on Balthazar's livery signified. Since King Melchior bore a field of stars and King Caspar, the moon, it is fairly obvious that as an allusion, no doubt, to the celestial phenomenon which had guided them to Bethlehem. The original arms of the Magi had been the sun, the moon and the stars. I do not think it would be unreasonable to suppose that for whatever theological line of reasoning, the heraldic insignia of both Balthazar and the city of Lauengent had been changed at the same point in history. Blackness as an allusion to God, perhaps even more remarkable, especially from our perspective today, is evidence which would suggest that in the language of heraldry, the blackamoor could be an allusion to God himself. The most obvious of these examples are to be found in the arms of the city of Coburg, the Cobb family of Nuremberg and the Pucci of Florence. Since these three names are derived from that of Jacob, Coburg equals Jacoburg, Cobb equals Jacob, Pucci equals Jacopucci. The clue is to be found in the book of Genesis. Very much along the lines of the old Hebrew injunction against uttering the holy name, it was the 2nd century theologian, Dionysius the Areopagite, who first alluded to God as the divine darkness. In the passage relating the changing of his name to that of Israel, Jacob discovers that the dark spirit he has wrestled with all night long is none other than God in the impenetrable image of his infinite self. The fact that the name, James, is nothing other than a variant of Jacob, might well provide us with the significance for the arms of Sardinia I described earlier, since it is to the Aragonese king, James I, that their use can first be traced. Blackness as wisdom. One of the most dramatic and, certainly, most graphic uses of blackness as wisdom can be seen in the portrayal of the good thief from a number of 15th-century Flemish masterpieces depicting the crucifixion. For the ability to recognize his Savior's spiritual supremacy beneath the harsh reality of the cross, Saint Dismas is not only painted as an African, he is painted blindfolded as well. The blindfold on certain blackamoor coat of arms, therefore, is not a mistakenly placed headband or towards the standard headpiece of this specific symbol when a crown is not called for. This blazon is, instead, an exhortation or, more precisely, a divine demand that we not only respond to the weakest and most helpless of our neighbors as we would our Lord, but, like Saint Dismas, that we do so even while in the death throes of our own personal crucifixions. Interestingly enough, the number of early theologians writing on this subject have attributed to the black wise man color the same kind of reasoning from which Saint Dismas would derive his doubly dark imagery, his ability to recognize the Messiah in a lowly manger. The social gospel so strikingly symbolized by this example of the blackamoor blazon is also, interestingly enough, quite implicit in even its most negative use, that of the vanquished infidel. From what is known regarding the popularity of the Charlemagnean epics during the latter Middle Ages, we can assume that this image was, in all probability, associated with Marcel, the black heathen king who, as the enemy of all Christendom, was Charlemagne's paramount opponent. Offered baptism at his defeat, Marcel had instead chosen death rather than accept a faith whose adherents he scornfully mocked and condemned for their immoral and reprehensible treatment of the poor. An image that was so scathing a reminder of a community's responsibility to its less fortunate could, therefore, have only been perceived as a positive one. The relationship of the black image to the concept of justice was nowhere more politically utilized than with the Holy Roman Emperors of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Indeed, it would appear that the sable blazon of the imperial eagle and that of the Moor's head were meant to be perceived as synonymous. The simple headbands worn by both are, as a matter of fact, identical and, interestingly enough, nothing less, despite the simplicity of the design, than the imperial diadem of ancient Rome. Also interesting is the fantastic coat of arms attributed to Ethiopia by the heralds of the Middle Ages. For like the bicephalic bird of the Holy Roman Empire, Ethiopia bore a V-shaped emblem with a blackamoor's head towards at the end of each arm. This parallelism between both sets of heads can, of course, be explained by the Rex/Sacerdoce argument which occupied the very center of the political stage during this particular period of history. To both the Pope who preached the imperial nature of his sanctified position and the Emperor, Frederick II, who believed in the priestliness of his own power, the figure of the African priest-king, Prester John, became an almost magical icon politically. If we can interpret the double-headed eagle represented the claims of both the Church and the State, it would be quite logical to surmise that the reason why Ethiopia's arms were conceived as double-headed is due to the belief already mentioned that the Negus emperor exercised the prerogatives of both priest and king. As Joseph Campbell has pointed out, it was to this African figure that European literature first attributed the very concept of popular justice. Indeed, While the church showed off his famous letter of introduction and circulated copies of it to the Christian world, rumors in Frederick's own lifetime made him an intimate friend of this semi-mythical king. According to popular belief, for instance, Prester John had presented him with armor made of asbestos, the elixir of youth, a ring of invisibility and, most precious of all, the philosopher's stone. Because they are described in the Tristan und Iseult cycles, the arms of Sir Palamedes, the Moorish prince who becomes a knight of the Round Table, have received a certain amount of scholarly attention. Checkered in black and white, this highly contrasting design would appear to be nothing more than perhaps the most abstract icon of those dualities already pointed to, such as God and Jacob. Jacleto is the word for checkered in Spanish or church and state. Instead of his coat armor, it is the body of Sir Theodore Fitzangevin, the Black Knight from Eschenbach's Article that is patterned in a piebald motif. The fact that the poet likens Theodore Fitz's skin to a parchment with writing is what expands this symbol to its most encompassing parameters. To the Greeks, Palamedes, the mythological figure from whom Sir Tristan's Moorish companion derives his name, was commemorated as the inventor of writing, counting, weighing and measuring and the games of the chessboard. Since his name translates as ancient wisdom, it has been suggested that all dualistic tensions were intended to be nuanced, from the most simple yes or no, or I to the most sophisticated of Parmenides' model regarding the I and the thou or the one and the many. Obviously playing with the same kind of bifurcated symbolism as the Hohenstaufen eagle for the two-headed branch of Ethiopia, the writer of the prose Tristan recounts that of all the knights of the Round Table, Sir Palamedes was the only one who wore two swords. Whether as a reference to Palamedes' name or the political wisdom Prester John stood for, or, perhaps, as a conflation of both, it is interesting that the blackamoor's head was one of the earliest watermarks in the history of papermaking. Examples collected date from about 1380 to 1460. Another possible reason for the imagery of Sir Palamedes could well have been a rather ironic geopolitical one. During the Dark Ages the culture of the Roman Empire had, for the most part, been fairly obliterated. During the Crusades, Western intellectuals became all too aware that it was their adversaries they would have to turn to for any advance in their educational systems since the Muslim world had become the reservoir of classical Greco-Roman learning. Due to the Saracen sages with which Frederick II surrounded himself, for example, Sicily developed into one of the most important intellectual centers of Europe, spreading the scholarship that had been derived from Arab translations. His court was so Islamic in its splendor that not only in the Middle East but throughout Europe he was referred to as Sultan. Since the Fatimid dynasty of Egypt during the 11th and 12th centuries had been of Sudanese extraction, and because their armed forces during this period had been augmented by a complement of 50,000 black troops a year, it should not be too difficult to understand how the image of the African had come to be associated, like Sir Palamedes, with ancient wisdom.